All right, well, we're in John chapter 6. So if you got a Bible, turn to John chapter 6. We'll get there in a minute. If you're in our app, follow along with our notes in there. Everything should be there. Um, now, we're in this section here where we're in the kind of the second section of this other part about the Jewish feast. So John's got four feasts that he's going to talk about, and Jesus is going to do something at each of these times. And tonight's no different. The Passover is going to get mentioned, although he's not really at the Passover feast. It's just John tells us that detail that this is the time of year that it was. So, but it all kind of connects either way. So, what we're going to do tonight is we're going to read a story. We're going to cover verses 1 through 21. And a couple stories there. There's the feeding of the 5,000, and then there's the storm and Jesus walking on the water, right? And these are stories that we're all familiar with, right? Everybody remembers these stories, right? He feeds 5,000 people with a sack lunch, right? And then he walks on, rough seas. But as usual, there's this entire Old Testament background that John intends you to have in your head. Now, we've learned this all the way since chapter 1. We're supposed to have Genesis and Exodus in our minds, right? Yes? So when we read John's gospel, we always need to be like rolling around the creation story, what was going on there, the Exodus story, what's going on there. And as we read with those stories in our head, you will see the connection. So what we're going to do tonight is kind of walk through that and see what's going on. And by the end tonight, I'm going to spend a minute answering the question, why is it so important for us to see the connection between the Jesus story and the Exodus story? Because if you read Matthew's gospel, it's very clear Matthew is presenting Jesus as a new Moses, right? And if you read John's gospel, it's pretty clear in there he's presenting Jesus as a new Moses performing a new Exodus. So why are they doing that? And that's what we're going to focus on at the end, because as we go through this, you're going to see it's loaded with Exodus stuff. So now, before we even dig into this, I've been asked a few times, how are you seeing all these Old Testament connections? And I'm gonna show you my cards here. Okay, I'm not that smart. Okay, there are times where I do find these things on my own, but a lot of the times I'm getting these from resources that point these things out, and I'm using the references that are already in your Bible, the little cross-reference things that I've showed you before. But here's two important resources. This one, the commentary on the New Testament use of the Old Testament. You can get that on Amazon. Now, it's like $50-something. It's a big book, okay? But what it is you just turn to whatever New Testament passage you're reading in your Bible, you turn to that passage in the commentary, and it'll just show you, like, hey, it's probably connected to this, and this, and it's really easy to go through that. And it also mentions intertestament literature, stuff like that. So it draws more connections than just the Old Testament. And I've been using that for a couple years, and it's awesome. Now, this is something that I got recently, the Orthodox Study Bible. You may not be aware of this, but there's an ancient church called the Greek Orthodox Church, or the Eastern Orthodox Church. And they split off from the Catholic Church when the Catholic Church decided they wanted to have popes who told everybody what to do. They were like, nah, okay, we've been upset with y'all for a while, we're out. We're not going there with you. And anyway, so I've been listening to some of their scholars and some of their pastors and teachers just to kind of see their point of view. And what I've learned is that the Eastern Orthodox crew, they read the Bible the way we've been learning to read the Bible here on Wednesday night. They're always connecting to the Old Testament and seeing the themes and the patterns and all that. And they've been doing this for like 2,000 years. So they have a study Bible. And like I said, I just got this, so there may be something crazy and off base in there I hadn't found yet. But so far, I'm pretty impressed with this study Bible. So there's a couple resources there. You can get both of these on Amazon if you're interested in that kind of thing. A study Bible is really easy to use. As an example, if you took the Orthodox Study Bible and turned to John chapter 6, in the study notes down below, the entire study notes are about, here's all the connections to the Exodus story. So they're already thinking this way. So now, because Orthodox is not Baptist, and it's not in the same exact tradition we're in, I just need to make sure you understand that you may find things in their study notes that we wouldn't agree with. All right, so when I recommend a resource, that doesn't mean I agree with everything in it. It just means this is useful. Eat the meat, spit out the bones, right? Okay, so anyway, just wanted to let you know that because I've had a couple people ask, how do you find these connections? And there's good resources for that. All right, well, we've got to have Genesis and Exodus in our minds when we're reading John. So let's start with Genesis. Genesis chapter 1, this is creation story. The second verse of your Bible mentions the Spirit of God, the Ruach of God, is moving on the surface of chaotic waters. Right? Remember this? In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. That's verse 1. And verse 2, and the earth was without form and void. It was chaotic, uninhabitable. And the Spirit of God was hovering over the face, the surface, of the deep waters. That's deep, chaotic ocean, right? And then in Genesis chapter 2, God provides food for humans, right? Because he plants a garden, and he plants a bunch of fruitful trees, right? And he takes Adam and he drops him in the garden, right? And he says, you can have all this to eat. So God's feeding people. So we got the Spirit of God hovering over the top of the waters, and we've got God feeding humanity. Got it? Okay, just hang on to that. And then here's all the Exodus stuff that shows up in what we're going to talk about tonight. Okay, now how many of you read John chapter 6 this week, or at least the first part of it? Okay, that's more than normal, so I'll take it. All right. So with that, what you read in your mind, let's just walk through this Exodus stuff. Okay. Now in Exodus chapter 7, verse 7 through 12. So you've got chapter 7 through chapter 12. That's the plagues, right? Now you need to understand that's the signs of the Exodus. Remember, because he tells Moses, I want you to go perform these signs before Pharaoh, right? And he's not going to believe you, and then we're going to do another one, and that happens 10 times, okay? So God uses Moses to perform signs. Now, is signs a big deal in John's gospel? Right. Okay, we're going to read about one, possibly two. And then Exodus 12 through 13, the people follow Moses into the wilderness. Yes? Okay, let's hang on to that. And they get to the sea, and God leads Israel through the sea, right? The chaotic waters. He leads them through it. And then on the other side, God changes bitter water into sweet water. Do you know that story? They get to a spring, and the water's bitter, and they can't drink it. And God tells Moses, take that log over there and throw it into the water, and it becomes sweet water. God changes something bitter into something sweet. Okay, hang on to that. And then in chapter 15, in that same story about the sweet water, God says, I am Yahweh, your healer. That's interesting. So we just saw a miracle about water, and God says that points to the fact that I am your healer. You would think he would say, I'm your brewer or something, like I'm your water sweetener. I'm your sweeten low. I don't know what he would say, but it doesn't make sense, does it? Like, I'm your healer. What does that mean? So just hang on to that. And then in chapter 16, God provides bread from heaven, right? And it was called manna. What does the word manna mean? I don't know exactly. It means, what is it? That's why they called it manna, because that word in Hebrew means, what is this? But it's bread from heaven, because the way that they gather it and the way they prepare it, it's bread, right? And then in chapter 17, God provides water from a rock, because they're all about to thirst to death and they're complaining, and God provides living water from the rock, right? And then in chapter 18, we're told this story about Moses becoming the judge of Israel. Y'all remember that story? His father-in-law comes along and sees that he's judging all the issues between the people. And his father-in-law, Jethro Clampett, okay, it was a good joke to me. He tells him this, like, you're going to die doing this. It's going to wear you out. You need to, like, have some help, you know. But Moses is a judge over God's people. That's interesting. So Moses in the Exodus story is a prophet because God speaks to him and he speaks for God to the people. That's a prophet. He's a priest because he goes into the tabernacle and does all kinds of things like a priest does throughout the story. And he's a leader, or you might call him a king. Matter of fact, the Israelites criticize him because they don't like the fact that he's acting as their king. They literally say that when they rebel against him. So he's a prophet, priest, and a king. Does any of this sound familiar to like a New Testament figure? Yeah. Okay. So that's the Exodus background. Now we're told at the end of the Torah, in Deuteronomy 18, Moses is talking to the people, and he says, Yahweh your God will raise up for you a prophet like me from among you, from your brothers. He's going to be an Israelite, and he's going to be a prophet like me. It is to him you shall listen. Does that phrase sound familiar? Listen to him? This is my beloved son. Listen to him? Yeah. And then in verse 18, God says, I will raise up for them, the Israelites, a prophet like you from among their brothers. And I will put my words in his mouth, and I will speak to them all that I command. He shall speak to them all that I command him. So this prophet who will be like Moses is going to hear what God says and speak only what he hears God say. Does that sound familiar? Yeah, John chapter 5. Okay, so that's the setup. Now you have what an ancient Israelite would have had in their head when they were watching Jesus do and say these things. This is Israel's foundation story, right? This is their salvation story. They know this story really well. Okay? It's been told to them throughout multiple feasts every year of their life. They retell all these stories. They know it. Okay? They know it way better than we do. All right? All right, so here's John 1 through 5, a little review, and then we're going to jump into chapter 6. John 1 is the prologue where we were given all those themes we're supposed to be tracking and following. And then also at the end of chapter 1, after the prologue, we're given 7 titles of Jesus, 7 different titles that Jesus is going to be called throughout the rest of the book. Right? So that was chapter 1. And then 2 through 4 was what we call the Cana cycle. Remember, it begins in Cana and ends in Cana, chapter 4. And he does 2 signs. The first one, he changes water into sweet wine. Do you get it? Changing water, bitter water into sweet water. Jesus kind of one-ups that one and says, this is going to be from water to wine, right? A sign of blessing, by the way, in the Jewish community. The second one is he heals an official's son. He's a healer. Okay? And then in chapter 5, obviously, we just read that story last week. He heals the man at the pool where they're waiting on the waters to be troubled and chaotic so they can be healed. And Jesus shows up and says, no, you don't need that. You need me. And he heals the guy. And that leads to a conversation where Jesus claims to be the judge of all nations. You see the connections back to Exodus, right? Okay, we'll see it more as we go. All right, ready? Verse 1, chapter 6. After this, Jesus went away to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, which is the Sea of Tiberias. Now, won't spend a lot of time on this, but this is John's way of letting you know he knows what he's talking about. When he tells you the name of something and then tells you what the Romans call it, He's making sure, like, this is history. I'm not making this story up, okay? Verse 2. And a large crowd was following him because they saw the signs that he was doing on the sick. Okay? So in Exodus, Moses does a bunch of signs, and the Israelites, and a lot of the Egyptians, by the way, believe the signs, and follow Moses to the wilderness. Yes? Okay. Now, when Jesus is going to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, that's not like a city. That's a wilderness over there. Well, later on, he tells you which direction they were going. Okay. So he's going to the eastern side, and it's wilderness over there. A large crowd has seen him do signs, and they're following him out into the wilderness, right? And Jesus went up on the mountain, and there he sat down with his disciples. And by the way, the Passover feast of the Jews was at hand. It was almost time for that feast to happen. Now, the reason it's interesting he mentions Passover is because they're not in Jerusalem. And where does the Passover feast take place? Jerusalem. Everybody travels to Jerusalem to do the Passover feast, right? So why would John mention the Passover feast when they're not even in the place to celebrate Passover? He's just letting you know what time of year it is, right? Now, John's not big on chronology, so when he does mention something like that, you're supposed to pay attention to it, right? Because remember, he kind of jumbles up, moves things around chronologically. So Jesus goes up on a mountain. Is there somebody in the Old Testament that went up on a mountain from time to time? And then his closest people with him go up the mountain with him? Moses and the priest and the elders go up the mountain and meet with God. And it says they saw God. They beheld him. And then 2 chapters later it says, you can't see me or you'll die. Who do you think they were looking at up that mountain? It might have been Jesus. The physical representation of Yahweh, right? All right, so they're on a mountain and they sit down and it's Passover time. Lifting up his eyes then, seeing that a large crowd was coming toward him, Jesus said to Philip, "Where are we to buy bread so that these people may eat?" So Jesus is on the side of a mountain. He's done all these signs. All these people have followed him out in the middle of nowhere. And he looks up and sees this crowd of people, and he turns to Philip, which if I was Philip, I'd have been like, pass, I don't know the answer. Don't ask me any questions, all right? He says, Philip, where are we going to get bread? Where are we going to buy bread? You're in the middle of nowhere. Where are we going to buy bread so that these people can eat? And then John tells us, now he said this to test him because he himself knew what he would do. So we're told flat out, Jesus is not asking this question genuinely. He's not trying to get like Philip, hey, I'm new around here. Where do we go get bread? That's not what's going on here. It's, let's see what Philip's going to answer. He said this to test him. Now, if you go read those Exodus stories that we just talked about briefly, you'll find out in different parts of the Exodus story, God does things to test the people. And then sometimes they're doing things to test Yahweh, and that's bad, right? But he's doing certain things to test them. You can see this in Exodus 16 when God feeds Israel bread from heaven. God specifically tells Moses that he is testing them. That's Exodus 16 verse 4. So he's testing Philip, and we found out by the end of this story, we're not going to finish this whole story tonight because it's 71 verses, okay? So we're going to stop at the end of the storm scene, and we'll pick up next week. But we'll find out next week, this entire story in John chapter 6 was a test. It's a test to see who's serious about following Jesus or not. Because Jesus at the end of this discussion is going to say something really weird. Like, you all must be cannibals or you'll never enter the kingdom. That's what they would have heard anyway. He said, unless you eat my flesh and drink my blood. Right? He's going to say that in chapter 6. And then chapter 6, verse 66, it says, many of his disciples left and no longer followed him. Now the 666 thing doesn't mean anything. It's just interesting that that's the way it played out. But okay, so this whole thing's a test, and he's testing Philip. Okay, let's see what Philip's going to answer. Let's see how much he believes about me and what I can do. And Philip answered a common sense answer. Jesus, 200 days worth of wages. That's what 200 denarii is. 1 denarii is 1 day's wage for a common laborer. So 200 days of wages worth of bread would not be enough for each of them to even get a little. One of his disciples, that Andrew, and by the way, he's Simon Peter's brother, in case you forgot from chapter 1, said to him, "There's a boy here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish, but what are they for so many?" Okay, so Philip, where are we going to get enough bread for all these people? And Philip says, "I don't know. I mean, we'd have to have like 2/3 of a year's wages to buy enough bread for all these people." And Andrew says, "Hey, I found a sack lunch." But, that's not going to, don't even feed us. I won't even feed the 12, This is not going to work. Now, the cool thing here, and y'all know me, I love the Old Testament connections here, so sorry about that, but not sorry. If you did a search in some Bible software, which I may have done, for barley loaves in the Old Testament, you would land on 2 Kings chapter 4, verses 42 through 44. And I'll just listen. I'll read that passage for you. "So a man came from Baal Shalisha," because y'all know that place, right? "Bringing the man of God bread of the firstfruits." Okay, this is Elisha, not Elijah, but Elisha, right? He's a prophet. "He brings him 20 loaves of barley and fresh ears of grain from his sack. And Elisha said, 'Give it to the men that they may eat.' But his servant said, 'How can I set this before 100 men?'" That sound similar to this conversation, right? So some barley loaves and some grain are there, and go feed this to the men. And the guy responds by saying, "There's 100 men. This is not nearly enough." And he had 20 barley loaves in that story. So he repeated, "Give it to the men that they may eat, for thus says the Lord, they shall eat and have some left over." So he set it before them, and they ate, and they had some left over, according to the word of the Lord. That's in 2 Kings. So a guy comes up to a prophet and says, "Here's some barley loaves and some grain. Well, feed it to the men." Well, there's 100 of them. That's not going to work. Well, God says, feed it to them, and they'll have not only enough, they'll have some leftovers. Sound familiar? Mm-hmm. Okay. Jesus said, "Have the people sit down." Now there was much grass in the place because it's Passover and springtime. So there's some grass growing. So the men sat down, about 5,000 in number. That's just the men. If there's women and children there, you've got another 1,000 to 3,000 people at least. All right, so you got thousands of people. And Jesus, now listen to the wording here and the order that John put it in. "And Jesus took the bread, and when he had given thanks, he distributed it among them." He took the bread and he gave thanks, and then he spread it around. That sound like another story in the Gospels? And Jesus took the bread and he gave thanks and he broke it and he gave it to them. Yeah. It kind of sounds like the communion story, doesn't it? Okay. Maybe it's just me. No more desserts anymore. Everybody's sleepy. And so also the fish. And notice how there's all this focus on the bread, but there's and he took the fish too. It's all focused on the bread here. Verse 12, "And when they had eaten their fill, he told his disciples, 'Gather up the leftover fragments.'" It was leftovers, right? "That nothing may be lost." So they gathered them up and filled 12 baskets with fragments from the 5 barley loaves left by those who had eaten. Okay, so just like in that 2 Kings story, they ate barley loaves, and there wasn't nearly enough, except then there was enough, and then there were leftovers. Same thing's happening here, right? So don't you think that the audience, the people who were at this event, okay, don't you think they were connecting this that Jesus must be a prophet? Because he's doing something we know Elisha did in the Old Testament. He's also doing things from the Exodus story, and the main character of the Exodus story is Moses the prophet. They're going to be thinking, this guy must be a prophet. He's not just a healer, he's a prophet. He's like speaking for God, right? Now, there's all kinds of ideas about why the 12 baskets, right? And there's all kinds of crazy ideas about that. Some of them go way too far. Here's my thinking on the 12. Like, why would he mention the number of the baskets? How many disciples are there? 12. How many tribes of Israel are there? 12. So Jesus picks 12 disciples as a representative of Israel, 12 tribes of Israel. And then isn't he going to tell those 12 disciples when he sends them out in Matthew chapter 10 to the lost sheep of Israel? And didn't he tell them they were now going to be fishers of men? They're going to be gatherers of people, right? And he sends them out only to the lost sheep of Israel, and then later he sends them out to the Gentile cities, but he sends like 70 of them, right? So maybe this is like playing into that story a little bit. The 12 guys who represent the 12 tribes of Israel are gathering. Maybe that's connected, okay? That's the best connection I think we could find. There are people who take it much further, but they're totally making it up. So I'm not even going to tell you about those. When the people saw the sign that he had done, so John, very clear, this is one of the signs, right? They said, this is indeed the prophet who has come into the world. And perceiving that they were about to come and take him by force to make him king, Jesus ran away. He withdrew back to the mountain by himself. Okay? This is so interesting. Okay, so this is another sign. Now, what do they mean by the prophet? This must be the prophet. Singular, not just any old prophet. The prophet. Okay? Now remember what we read from Deuteronomy 18? Where God tells Moses, I will send a prophet like you to them, and I will put my words in his mouth, and he will speak all that I tell him to say. Right? That's the prophet they're thinking about. So, a minute ago I said, well, they're watching Jesus do all this. They would have been thinking, this guy's like Elisha. This guy's like Moses. And then Deuteronomy 18 popped in their head. Oh, wait. This must be the one, the prophet that God promised to bring to us. Because he's doing all these signs just like Moses did, right? Just like Elijah and Elisha did. All right, and then they're like, he's the prophet, let's make him king. Why would they make that jump? Because in the Old Testament, is the king also the prophet in Israel? No. The king always has a prophet. Sometimes he's got bad prophets. But God also sends him a true prophet to each king to tell him almost every time the prophet is there to go, you're doing it wrong. You're doing this wrong. You're leading the nation wrong. You're violating the law. You're messing up the Torah. You offered a sacrifice you're not authorized to offer. Like, what are you thinking, guy? Like, that's the role of the prophet almost every time, right? They're two separate things. Except when it was Moses, because Moses was a prophet. He did priestly things, and he was the leader of the people. He was the king, even though that's not the title he took for himself, right? So why would they say he's the prophet, now let's make him king? Well, it's because all this other stuff in the Old Testament, in the last part of the Old Testament, and in the intertestament period, everybody was thinking when the Messiah shows up, he's going to be prophet, priest, and king. That's what the Messiah is. So when they think he's the prophet we've been waiting on, he's the prophet like Moses, their next jump is, well, he's got to be the Messiah, let's make him king. All right? And Jesus knows all this, even though we're not told they said that. It says he perceived that this was in their minds. And his reaction is, not today. and he goes back up the mountain. Now, I might be pushing it here, but if you go read that Exodus story at Mount Sinai, Moses goes up the mountain and back down the mountain and up the mountain and back down the mountain and up the mountain and back down the mountain like 7 times. That might not be exactly 7, but I think I'm right on that. It might be 10. I don't know. But he goes up and down the mountain a lot. Remember, he goes up, spends time with God, and gets the commandments, comes down there worshiping a golden calf that, fell out of a fire on accident, and he has to go back up the mountain and beg God not to kill them all, right? And then he goes back down the mountain. And he goes back up with Aaron and the priests and the elders. Then he goes back down the mountain, right? We're probably supposed to connect that with Jesus withdrawing from the people, going back up the mountain. So, all right, now, I put this in your notes, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, but you just need to know this. I told you what the 7 signs were like week 1. I passed out all those handouts, and it has all that stuff on it, okay? If you read the Orthodox Study Bible, and many other scholars take this view that aren't Orthodox people, they numbered the signs a little differently than what I handed to you. And I do think it's interesting. So they count the next story we're about to read, the walking on water, they count that as a sign. Okay, so that puts the 7th sign at the raising of Lazarus, which makes Jesus' resurrection the 8th sign. Now, why does that matter? Well, some of you have studied like what biblical numbers represent. And does anybody happen to know what the number 8 represents? New beginning or new creation? Yeah, so that could be the case. But the next story we're about to read, it certainly reads kind of like a sign because it's a big miracle, right? Big deal. All right, when evening came, his disciples went down to the sea. Now he's telling us what time of day it is, isn't he? When evening came, which means it's dark. We'll come back to that. When evening came, his disciples went down to the sea. They got into a boat and they started across the sea to Capernaum. So here's what that means. They were on the eastern shore, from your point of view, the eastern shore, and they get into a boat to go to the northwestern shore where Capernaum is. That's where they're headed. And just in case you missed that it was evening, it was now dark. You see how John wants you to get it? This is a moment of darkness. Now, in John's gospel, what are you supposed to expect when he tells you it was dark? Confusion, disbelief, doubt. That's usually in the story when he mentions that it's dark, right? Remember, Nicodemus came at night. He's confused the whole time, right? The lead teacher of Israel doesn't understand anything. So it was now dark, and Jesus had not yet come to them because he's still hanging out on the mountain, right? And the sea became rough because a strong wind was blowing. Do you see it? What are you supposed to be thinking about right now? Exodus, the Red Sea crossing. A strong wind was blowing. If you go back and read the Exodus story, it clearly tells you a strong east wind. God blew a strong east ruach, wind / spirit, over the water and troubled the water, roughed it up, and parted the waves, right? A strong east wind. So the sea became rough because there was a strong wind blowing. And when they had rowed about 3 or 4 miles, they saw Jesus walking on the sea. They saw God hovering over the face of the waters. Genesis 1:2, right? And by the way, that wind that was blowing, they saw Jesus coming from that direction. He's coming from the east. A strong east wind is coming with him, right? And he's coming near the boat, and they were so happy. They were frightened. The Greek word here is phobos. Fear. They were terrified. If you were going to read this with the right inflection, it would say, they saw Jesus walking on the sea and coming near the boat, and they were freaking terrified. I mean, it's strong. They were scared out of their minds. Now, The reason why I know that is because if you go read Matthew's version of this, you go read the other Gospels, it tells you that they thought he was a ghost, right? Here's what that means. They believed you could see a ghost. So when people ask you, well, what does the Bible say about seeing ghosts? Well, there's quite a few in there, by the way. They thought Jesus was one time. Go read that story when Saul goes to the witch doctor and she calls up Samuel to have a conversation. Samuel's been dead a while. So anyway, just our paranormal friends a few doors down would love this conversation. But so they think he's a ghost. That's why they're so scared. They don't recognize exactly who he is. By the way, this situation is going to happen again at the end of John's gospel, right? Something like this. Now, so what do you think an Israelite sitting in a boat, rowing on the sea with a strong east wind blowing, and a person comes walking across a rough sea? What stories stuck in their minds? They're going to be thinking about Exodus. No doubt, right? And they're making those connections. Now, it may have been after they, changed their tunic and thought about it a while, but they definitely were making this connection. Let's read this real quick. I bet they also had this passage in their mind. Psalm 77, which is talking about the Exodus story. Stop it and all that. Okay. When the waters saw you, O God, when the waters saw you, they were afraid. Indeed, the deep trembled. The clouds poured out water. The skies gave forth thunder. Your arrows flashed on every side. Isn't that a neat image for lightning? It's like God's arrows. Yeah. The crash of your thunder was in the whirlwind. Your lightnings lighted up the world. The earth trembled and shook. Your way was through the sea, your paths through the great waters, yet your footprints were unseen. So whoever wrote this is thinking about the Exodus story and picturing God walking on water. Isn't that what it seems to be describing? Yeah? And you led your people like a flock by the hand of Moses and Aaron. You led them like sheep. All right, so just let that hang out in your mind. But Jesus said to them, because remember they're soiling their tunics in the boat. He says, I am. Do not be afraid. Now your Bible probably says it is I or it's me or something like that. And by the way, the Chosen episode, when they did this scene, they nailed the scene. It was so awesome. The finale of Chosen, season whatever it is, 3. They did a great job, except for this line. They messed it up because they had this beautiful moment going on, and they're all terrified, and Jesus really kind of looks like a ghost in the scene. It's pretty awesome. And instead of saying what he literally said in the Greek, I am, he goes, it's me. I was like, oh, right? Doesn't have the force that I am would have on a Jewish listener, right? They're all Jews in the boat. I am, do not be afraid. Then they were glad. They went from terrified to hearing him say that, and then they were glad to take him into the boat. I'd be glad to get him in the boat too, because he can stay on top of the water in the storm. Let's put him in the boat. Right? Makes perfect sense, doesn't it? And immediately, look at this. The other gospel writers don't tell you this part. And immediately the boat was at the land to which they were going. Now the other gospel writers tell you a lot more detail than John does, right? There's that whole thing about Peter getting out and walking on the water and then having doubts and sinking, that whole thing, right? John completely leaves that out. But they left out this detail that when he got in the boat, boom, they were where they were supposed to be. Right? Now, you'd think, why does he put that detail in here? Well, Psalm 107 is probably why. We'll go there real quick. Now you have to kind of go read down through this. This is talking about like basically Israel's whole story in this passage. Okay, verse 23, Psalm 107. Some went down to the sea in ships, doing business on the great waters. They saw the deeds of the Lord, the wondrous works in the deep. In other words, people have like been out on boats in the sea, and they've noticed there's some really big stuff living in those waters. Right? That's what they're talking about here. For he commanded and raised the stormy wind and lifted up the waves of the sea. They mounted up to heaven. Remember, this is all poetry, right? They mounted up to heaven. They went down to the depths. Their courage melted away in their evil plight. They reeled and staggered like drunken men, and they were at their wits' end. And they cried to the Lord in their trouble, and he delivered them from their distress. He made the storm be still, and the waves of the sea were hushed. Then they were glad that the waters were quiet. They were afraid. He calmed the storm, and they were glad. Sounds like what we just read in John, right? They were glad that the waters were quiet, and he brought them to their desired haven. See it? See, God calms a storm, they're glad, and then he brought them where they wanted to go. Okay? It's like the same story, except the one in Psalms was written centuries before this event. Now, so here's what we just found out. John chapter 6 is meant to be read in the context of the Exodus story. But it's more than that, okay? So here's the question. You got Matthew doing this in his gospel, and you've got John doing this, like for sure doing this. His gospel is that Jesus is doing a new Exodus. That's why I titled tonight's teaching Exodus 2.0. Okay, I had a longer title that was cooler, but things that I think are funny nobody else does, so I just called it Exodus 2.0. Why are the gospel writers doing this? Why are they presenting Jesus as a new Moses, and what he's here to do is a new Exodus? Why is that so important? Certainly for Matthew and for John, right? And this is a very important question. Okay, now I've written some stuff in the notes. I'm just going to read from them so I can make sure I say what I mean to say here. The reason they do this is to show the reader the meaning of salvation and the meaning of the gospel. Now, you might be thinking, well, don't we already know what that means? Don't we know what salvation means, and don't we know what the gospel means? Do you? Are you sure you know what those words mean? Because if your idea about salvation and the gospel doesn't include the Exodus story, you're missing it. At best, you're missing some of it, right? Okay? Now, any definition or theology of the gospel that is not grounded in the Exodus story is bound to distort the meaning of the gospel. Okay, listen, you would not believe how many books I've read that are trying to tell you what the gospel is. There's tons of them that pastors write and theologians write, like, here's the gospel. This is my opinion of what the gospel is. I don't remember. I've probably read 12 of those books. I don't remember any of them talking about the Exodus story. Now, that might not mean anything to you, but just listen to this, okay? Some modern theologians reinterpret the gospel, and here's the gospel for them. God is ticked off about sin. And he needs somebody to pay for it. So he sent his only son and killed him instead of us. Have you heard that gospel presentation before? We probably all have in many ways, right? Okay, so God's angry about sin. So he kills his only son so he wouldn't have to kill us, right? Now let me just work that out logically for you. And we're going to do a little more of this on Sunday, by the way. Invite your friends. That'll be great. So God killed Jesus instead of killing us because of God's wrath. So in that view, God sent Jesus to save us from God's wrath, right? According to that view. In other words, logically, that means Jesus came to save us from God. Because God's angry and somebody's got to pay, and Jesus comes and says, kill me instead, then Jesus is essentially saving us from the Father. Does that sound right to you? No, it's because it's not right. That's not very good news, is it? God was so angry he wanted to kill you. But don't worry, he killed his own kid instead of you. Good news. It doesn't sound good to us because it's not. It makes God's reputation out to be this angry God who can't deal with sin. He's got to make somebody pay for it. Do you realize that Jesus' parables about forgiveness, he often tells a story about someone who had a great debt and it was just forgiven? Nobody had to pay. It was just forgiven. But here's the deal. The last 500 years of theology since the Reformation, this has been the predominant view in the Western world, is that God is ticked off, and instead of killing you, he killed his own kid. And that somehow fixed it. So the death of his only son made him happy, so he's not mad at you now. Now, that for some reason that might sound correct to you, but it's not the biblical view. This is why it's so important that when we think about salvation, we have to think about the Exodus story. Because in the Exodus story, is God mad at his own people? It never says anything about him being mad at his own people. Who is God mad at in the Exodus story? Who's he rescuing the people from? Egypt, right? He's ticked off with Pharaoh and the Egyptians, specifically the gods of the Egyptians. You realize in the Exodus story, God explicitly says, I am doing this against the gods of Egypt. Those rebel spirits who've set themselves up as gods, right? So God's not mad at Israel. And you know, it doesn't say anything about Israel's sin in that story. Do you think Israel was sinning at all while they were in slavery for 430 years? I imagine they sinned a few times, but that's not even brought up. God saves us because we're sinners. Right? That's why we needed saving. Right? We're in bondage to sin and Satan and death. Right? So when Jesus shows up on the scene, who is Jesus mad at? Come on, let's interact here. Who is Jesus mad at when he shows up on the scene? Anybody? Is he mad at anybody? Pharisees, hello. Woe to you, you're dead men walking, right? You swallow a camel and strain out a gnat. He seemed pretty angry at those guys. Is he angry at the prostitutes and the drunkards and the tax collectors? Oh, so all the sinners he's not angry at. But he seems to be pretty ticked off with that devil, right? And that's who he shows up to defeat. Jesus shows up to do what God was doing in Exodus for one nation. Jesus shows up to do it for all nations. So when you think about the gospel and you ponder and meditate on the good news, you need to be thinking about the Exodus story, because that is what every Israelite Jesus met thought about. When he says, I have come to save you, they were thinking Exodus. He's here to do what God did for us in the Exodus. We're held in bondage to sin, to Satan, to death. And he's come to get us out of that kingdom and take us into his kingdom. Now that's good news, isn't it? So instead of us saying, God's ticked off, somebody's got to pay, don't worry, Jesus paid it. Okay? Now look, I believe Jesus paid it all, okay? I even like the song. Okay? But we should be thinking about the gospel message in terms of rescue. Salvation, the word literally means rescue or deliverance. He came to save us from our enemy. And our enemy was not the Father. This was all the Father's idea. So we're not being saved from his wrath. We are being saved from our own wrath. We're being saved from Satan's wrath against humanity. We're being saved from the power, the spiritual power of sin that's always trying to destroy us. We're being saved from death itself. Because those who are in Christ don't actually die. So, that's my answer to that question. So here's the conclusion. God, through Moses, rescued Israel from slavery. Then he dwelt among them, didn't he? Remember, he was in the middle of the camp. They were to set up their camp around the presence of God, right? So he rescues them from slavery. He dwells with them, and he leads them to a promised place, the promised land, right? Exodus 2.0. God, through Jesus, rescues all nations from slavery, dwells among them, in the middle of them, and leads them to a promised place. That's new creation, or heaven and then the new creation. It's the same story, just bigger and better. John chapter 6 is trying to tell you that Jesus is here to do Exodus 2.0, except it's Exodus on steroids. Because Exodus was only about Israel. Jesus shows up and says, I'm a new Moses, this is a new Exodus, except I'm saving everybody this time, not just one nation. It's good, isn't it? Yeah. All right, here's what we're going to do next time. We're going to try to finish chapter 6. So that's a lot of verses, but it's easy to read because it's a conversation going on. So read verses 22 through 71. You will not get bored with this passage. This is where he talks about, I am the bread of life, and some big statements in there. He's going to allude back to the Exodus story. Jesus is flat out going to say, hey, y'all, think about Exodus. That's what I'm doing here, okay? So I'm not making up all this Exodus stuff like I stole it from Jesus, okay? And then he's going to say that weird like cannibal thing at the end, and everybody's going to leave. And he's going to try to get his disciples to leave too. He's going to be like, you want to go with them? Head out. So this is a little intense, okay? So read verses 22 through 71, and we'll see if we can get through all that next time. We'll see how far we get, okay?